Start recording. There you go. We're going to get started in just a second. My name is Brian Rickle, and I've just been hosting these town halls for Kamaal. I'm a huge supporter. I know we have a guest tonight, and we'll do some screen sharing, got some videos to show. But I just kind of want to let us jump in and get started. And I'm going to turn this over to Kamaal. And I just kind of, the chat. So I have the chat turned off for everybody, but if you have questions throughout the evening, throw them in the chat. I take them in the order they come as best as I can. We don't edit anybody's questions. If you got a question, ask it honestly, ask it authentically. This is an open conversation about, tonight we're talking about law enforcement and public safety and public health. But if you have a question that's not attached to that, feel free to ask it. I'm really, really, really grateful you're all here, and I'm just going to stop talking and turn this over, and there we go.
Much appreciation, Brian. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kamaal Martin. Thank you for joining us. I see some familiar faces. If you are looking for the Vote Kamaal virtual town hall about law enforcement, public health, and public safety, you are in the right place. And for those of you who've been with us a number of times, we wanted to switch up the format a little bit and bring in some guests to add some additional experience, value, and context to the conversation about law enforcement. Since we're still a smaller group right now, what I think will be really helpful, if folks don't mind, in the era of Zoom and anonymity, it's good to know that we all know who's here to the extent possible. There we go. I'm seeing some faces and stuff showing up there. Fantastic, fantastic. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. I'm really excited about two people who are joining us for the first time today. The first is Ms. Sharon Sampson, faculty member over at Grossmont College, does a lot of work in the justice space. She's a colleague of Mr. Rickle. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting her yet, but I wanted to make sure that we had some representation from the community college as well as some additional practitioners involved in the conversation as well. And another reason for that is I think any good elected official is really a generalist at best, or some of the best ones are generalists, and every once in a while you might get a technocrat or a specialist. But it's not about any one person having all the answers. It's about having the ability to find the experts, the ability to find the answers and to propel a conversation. And that's part of what we're trying to do. Another colleague and friend of mine is Mr. Brandon Lee. Mr. Lee is joining us from the Pacific Northwest. He used to be a San Diego resident, and he is a nationally renowned expert on community building and law enforcement. So part of what we wanted to talk about today is two parallel tracks, if you will. And just to give you kind of a snapshot of the landscape, all the way back to 2018, I've been talking about the largest line item in our budget in the city of Lemon Grove, which is law enforcement. A budget is more than just a document that tells you how much money is going where. It's a statement of values, right? How you spend your money is an indication of who you are, what you believe in, and what you value. And the extent to which that, 45, 46% of our general fund is going to law enforcement in a town of 3.9 square miles, 25,000 people, we have 21 sheriff's deputies. And I think we're allowed to ask ourselves, how much is too much? How much is enough? What's the right amount? And as important as this election is for the future of Lemon Grove on so many fronts, it's important for another reason, in that the sheriff's contract that we have expires in June of 2022. So whoever our leaders are entering office in November are going to play a huge role in the renegotiation process of that contract. Now, let me be clear before anybody attempts to assume or put words in my mouth. I'm not advocating that we don't renew the contract with the sheriffs. What I'm advocating is a thoughtful, incisive, and really profound investigation and analysis of that contract, of all of the services that we are paying for, of all of the services that we're asking and expecting the Sheriff's Department to provide, and what really is the right tool for the right job in all of these cases. The city of Del Mar, the city of Imperial Beach, as two additional cities that both contract with the Sheriff's Department. You know, there are 9 of us in the county. Both of those cities for quite some time have seen the writing on the wall and law enforcement expenditures starting to spiral out of control. Just recently, the city of IB, their city council, created a review of sheriff expenditures and the preliminary steps to a deeper study. And we'll get a little bit deeper into that in a second. But before we go too far down that road, I wanted to highlight some of the work of Mr. Lee. And he has an introductory video that he's going to play to show us, a little bit more about his work, set some of the context for the conversation, and, the role that community building plays in a city and with law enforcement. One of the really significant problems from my perspective is the whole paradigm is skewed in that oftentimes you don't talk to a cop unless you're a victim, you're a suspect, or a perpetrator. And it's a really damaging paradigm, right? Because it's a difficult thing to deal with people and humans at their worst all the time. And you begin to, it's challenging to not let that carry over in other ways. As I've been reading our sheriff's contracts, other contracts from around the city, just to kind of get a baseline and see what's different, what's the same. One of the things that I found interesting, and maybe Mr. Lee will be able to touch on this, in Del Mar and Imperial Beach, both of these cities described more of a need for community outreach. And one of the methods of, one of the suggested methods of community outreach the Sheriff Department responded that they would provide was additional pedestrian stops and additional traffic stops. I was like, wait a minute, like, how is that supposed to make the relationship better if you stop more people when they're walking or in their cars? So there's some gaps in communication. I think there's some philosophical gaps. And hopefully, Mr. Lee can help kind of walk us through some of the work that he's done in a number of, big city police departments in the state of Oregon and beyond, to provide some insight and guidance into ways that we could be thinking or should be thinking about how we want to engage with law enforcement, and how to get a Lemon Grove lens placed on that document that really reflects our needs to the fullest extent possible. So I'll stop there. Mr. Rickle, if you could go ahead and play that video.
Can everybody hear that? Was everybody able to hear that just now?
I couldn't hear it. Maybe if you you may have to stay unmuted as you play it, Brian. Maybe that'll help.
Then. How about that?
No.
Nope. Okay, hold on here. That doesn't make any sense. This all worked the other day in the class, so I'm not sure why it's not happening right now. You can see the video though, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
Sometimes when you click open the video, there might be a little box you have to check that says share with audio or something like that.
Right.
I have that. I'm sharing with audio. Nope, that's going to take us off the video. Sorry, guys. Give me 1 second. I literally just did this in class yesterday.
No
take your time.
Let's go back to here. Let's go back here. Screen here. There it is. Share computer sound. I got it. Thank you. That's a new part of their update. Okay, this should work. Let's do it.
Right. My husband and my son were both killed.
So this is the infamous Fruitvale Station. You've heard of folks like Michael Brown from St. Louis, but here you might hear names like Oscar Grant, Derek Jones, Brandon Lee. The difference between myself, Brandon Lee, and Oscar Grant and others is that they died and they paid the ultimate price, losing their life to police brutality and senseless violence. We saw 2, 3 different police cars with at least 2 officers in each car. And that represents the type of occupation that we felt while growing up in Oakland. No matter where you were, there was someone that had eyes on you. And based on their interpretation, our lives could be at stake. Because I've grown up with lived experience of being racially profiled, I don't want my kids growing up in that world.
One of the purpose of T4T is to bring law enforcement in the same room as community members, without the guns, without the uniform, where they really can see eye to eye with the people that they're serving. What this creates is this real engagement where they can actually connect beyond the stereotypes, beyond the judgments that everyone has with each other. And so they can be real and human and connect.
I think it's important that we practicalize or use practices and not the romanticizing of our past. And T4T has found a way to take the essence of what we consider community patrolling and community organizing and brought it to the boardroom. So we say the block to the boardroom, so to speak. And it's important that that connection and that synergy be made, because there is no conversation without the grassroots dialogue.
As a black man who spent most of my life and energy fighting law enforcement on racial profiling cases, I believe it has become my calling to pave a proactive and preventative path to saving lives, reducing violence, and liabilities. The ordinance of Training for Transformation began in Oakland, California, where I was raised and the victim of racial profiling. But when we arrived here in Oregon, we began to work as an advocate and now an agent of change, bringing community and law enforcement together.
So if I were to describe T4T in a couple of words, I would say dedicated, committed, deeply driven, wise. Him and Hoon lead with their heart, and they're committed to this work.
Because I was so angry from this one incident that, you know, every time I saw a police officer, I was upset or scared or feared them. So what was unique about the Train for Transformation program is you invite the community in with you along with the police officers. And I thought that was different. It brought a more humane aspect to the police. You know, these people they're human as well. They make mistakes. Not all police are bad.
Yeah, treat the police courteously and with respect, not just for them, but for yourself. I've seen police misinterpret perhaps something that was happening on a traffic stop and someone gets hurt seriously. What we want to do on the street is make sure you're able to communicate with the officer if you're going to get a citation or get arrested, but we're not here to have any sort of conflict on the street. It's not a good place. It's not a good place.
My family was drastically impacted by the Oakland Police Department in 1993. My husband and my son were both killed. And a police officer was killed. As I said at the time, and I still believe, that if my husband wasn't black and if my son wasn't mixed, I think the police would have handled the situation quite differently.
So there was another example of a young man, African-American male, who was riding his bike through a college campus. An officer pulled a gun on him, thinking that he was a suspect, but he was wrong. Because of our community affiliations, we were able to bring the police chief together with this young man in the same room. With the law enforcement side, we were able to help them avoid a lawsuit. But for the young man, most importantly, we were able to rebuild his faith that he had lost through that experience. And what I found watching the chief look him in the eye and apologize for what happened to him, but most importantly, he asked, "Will you forgive me?" And so it's in that moment that I realized this is what I was called to do. And this is an example of training for transformation, taking traumatic experiences and turning them into healing opportunities.
T for T is a step up to bridge the community and the police.
You know, the Train for Transformation project brought new ideas on how they, community policing.
The work of T for T and police accountability efforts is absolutely vital.
For all those we've lost, we remember you. For everyone else, let's come together to build a better and safer community for our future.
I'm proud of you, Mom and Dad.
Oh, that was fantastic. And I think that really is a perfect opening to the conversation that, I'd like to have with you all today. It's bigger than simply the dollars that are advocated to law enforcement. It's bigger than simply what else can be done with those dollars. How can they be redirected, repurposed, or reallocated? We're here right now living with the sheriff's department, with law enforcement, whatever department or jurisdiction they may be from. So we don't have the luxury of waiting for certain things to happen. But one thing that I believe we can put in place now is something to bridge some of those gaps, to stem some of those divides, but to humanize the interactions going in both directions, correct? It's not a one-way street, it's a two-way street, but there's a lot of power that's involved in that dynamic. So with that, I'd like to pass it to my friend and colleague, Mr. Brandon Lee. Tell us some more about, kind of how you got involved in this work, the progression to where you are today with this work, and some of the successes and challenges that you've observed along the way in performing that service and that duty to the community. Mr. Lee?
Great evening. Are you able to hear me okay? Perfect. Number one, I just want to thank our host. It's always great to see you, Kamaal. Thank you for having me in your space. This is a noble topic. We've been doing a lot of work on this issue for quite some time. I'm happy to be a part of any conversation that's moving the conversation forward. A little bit about, I guess, my background. I'll start with kind of something that happened to me that inspired me into action as a community member. The day before I attended graduate school at the School for International Training, I was at home preparing to go. I was at my grandparents' home where I grew up in Oakland, California. My grandparents broke the cuddle lines in the Oakland Hills. I lived right across the street from Kamala Harris's parents, just to give you an idea of my background. And the day before graduate school, I ordered a pizza. I'm preparing to go. This is a big deal. Grandparents, they paved the way for me to be able to have this big opportunity. So I'm preparing to go. I order a pizza. Pizza comes. I enjoy it, fall asleep. When I wake up, the pizza delivery man is still outside my house, and I'm not sure why. And so I let them know my grandparents are coming home soon. He's gonna have to move his car. He apologizes. Oh, sorry, but I locked my keys in the car. African-American kid around, 16 years old. I feel bad for trying to rush him off, so I run outside. Now I'm trying to help him. And so we're trying to work out the car, trying to get to the keys in the car. And 2 or 3 police cars drive up really fast, hop out. When they come, I turn to them and I say, oh man, thank goodness, help is here. You should be fine now. You got plenty of help. I turn around and go back into the house. And when I turn around and go back in the house, I'm stopped by a couple of the officers who asked me to turn around and put my hands behind my back. And I'm completely thrown off, not sure why. And because I've been profiled before, I look him in the eye and I let him know that from this moment forward, he needs to abide by the book, because now I'm going to be basically already preparing my redress. Make a long story short, I was detained for over 2 hours in front of my own home, in front of neighbors that I grew up with. I was investigated as a burglar. It was just dehumanizing, degrading, and this was how I began my graduate school experience. Make a long story short, because of my 4 generations of history in Oakland, you know, quite frankly, I was pissed off. I submitted a complaint to Internal Affairs of Oakland. I was told that my case was going to be looked at. I was actually called by the director who knew some mutual friends and said, Brandon, I got this. Don't worry about it. It's in good hands. And make a long story short, I came to find out that she, the director who called me, actually just wanted to stall me out and didn't want me to pursue my complaint within a year window after the incident had occurred, because there's no disciplinary action that can be taken after 1 year. So it was strategic to use her community affiliations with some people that I knew for me to lay off the heat, for them to be able to basically skate past with no disciplinary action. So once I caught wind of what happened, I made it my mission to shut down that part of the Internal Affairs Department. There was already a coalition of police accountability who had already been on the grassroots, already applying pressure, already moving the agenda forward. They needed someone kind of like a Rosa Parks, who you know, looked good on paper and could bring their cause and articulate it to City Hall. And so we partnered together. We brought our case and basically said that we wanted the funds from the Internal Affairs Department. Since they were kind of incompetent, we had to prove they were incompetent to review our complaints, and that we were better suited to have our Civilian Oversight of Police Board funded with their budget. And so City Council and Mayor Kwan agreed, and the 1.4 million plus budget that was used for internal affairs to review citizen complaints or community complaints against the police, that money was transferred to fund the Civilian Oversight Board in Oakland, which, you know, they're working through challenges on every level, but, you know, based on my standards, they're now one of the strongest civilian oversight boards in the country. And they've got, you know, Measure S1 and some things that's even pushing the ball even forward. So that's just a story that kind of illustrates what inspired me to get into this work. And I've been fortunate to transition from, you know, what I would consider to be someone that's more of an agitator, someone who was just trying to survive policing. It's described in the new Jim Crow, written by Michelle Alexander, the conditions that we grew up in. And so there I was just trying to survive along with my peers and comrades growing up in Oakland, then transitioning to an advocate supporting others who have been racially profiled and supporting them in their redress. So supporting, advocating for others' civil rights. And then now working into the training piece, because I realized that there was a connection between accountability on the street and the training that they were getting in the academy. So from agitator to advocate to now someone who actually works, you know, kind of behind the wall to make sure we implement what we want to see in their curriculum. So that's kind of the 3 stages of my evolution.
Thank you so much for sharing some of that background and some of that context. If you could go into a little bit more depth about some of the departments that you've had the opportunity to work with, what the scope of that work entails, and how a city who may have an interest in performing some of that training with an organization like yours, how they get that process started. What does that look like?
Great question. We began, Training for Transformation began after community uprisings in Ferguson, Missouri, after the police-involved killing of Michael Brown, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Sandra Bland, who died in police custody in Texas. So our work was born out of lived experience. And I had students. I was a faculty member at Oregon State University at the time. I was an administrator, and I had students of color who were Black, Indigenous students of color who were being impacted negatively, seeing all of these videos, all of these killings happening. They were experiencing hate crimes on campus locally, and it was just a lot and very overwhelming. So what we did was we surveyed our students. We got a clear understanding that the negative experiences and racial profiling that they were having on and around campus was more than just single incidents. So as legal redress chairman of NAACP, I was able to establish like a pattern and practice. Like, okay, now in this peer group, we do have these systemic issues that are showing up. So I reached out to my local police department, and to be quite honest with you, the only reason why we didn't just go straight legal redress was because I didn't have their agency specifically named in the complaints. they were just saying police, and so there's like 5 different departments it could have been. So that opened the conversation to where what resulted from it was a community-led training. My wife and my business partner is a Cambodian genocide survivor. She's a peace builder by trade. Her background is in conflict transformation. And so we partnered together. We took input from community members, from the law enforcement leaders, but we drafted our own curriculum and basically demonstrated what we felt the community wanted to see from law enforcement. And we recruited community to come in along with the police department. What was great about it was the police agreed to not come in uniforms, no guns. We didn't train beside police. We were able to draft our curriculum and lead the training. So police served as co-participants beside the community members that they serve, and so that just leveled out the power dynamics. And so from locally, City of Corvallis Police Department, we trained on the state level, an annual training that involved probably 30 plus law enforcement agencies, 20 plus community members, 20 plus community organizations. So that was on a statewide level, and we've done redress all around the country. Just about everywhere I've lived and been profiled, I've had to do some level of redress. Marion County Sheriff's Department. So we've got quite a laundry list of people that we've worked with so far.
No, that's exactly the type of work and the type of commitment to an important part of, like I said, a system that's impacted so many of our lives in so many different ways. It's easy to get caught up in the enormity of it all and to throw your hands up and say, well, we can't do anything about this, or what are we going to do? All the more reason, from my perspective, in a town like Lemon Grove, where we've got 25,000 people, and one of the things we pride ourselves on is us being a tight-knit community, a community where people know one another, where people engage and interact, a community that arguably is one of the most diverse within San Diego County. So all the more reason for us to embrace all aspects and sectors of life professionally, law enforcement included, but recognizing when we look at the moment we find ourselves in nationally, this is absolutely something we cannot avoid in terms of looking at equity, in terms of looking at inequality, in terms of systemic racism. But again, on a very practical level, on the level of financial solvency and fiscal responsibility, to have 50% of your budget going to law enforcement is a recipe for disaster. Absolute disaster, and it is simply not sustainable. And in a town where we have some of the worst road conditions within San Diego County, we have a beautiful rec center that hasn't been open to all Lemon Grove residents with, I think, the expected degree of access. I can't say the rec center has been closed, but I can't say it's entirely open to everybody either. It's a resource issue, right? We've had to cut staff here. We've had to cut city staff. Lemon Grove is now in a position where per capita, we spend the least on our residents, compared to any other city within San Diego County. That shouldn't be a badge of honor. The fact that we, spend less on each person who lives here. Come to Lemon Grove, I promise you we'll spend less than the other guy. That's not the type of town I think any of us want to live in. But going back to my earlier remark about a budget being a statement of values, what do we value? And if each deputy costs somewhere around $250,000, when we look at salary, benefits, pension costs, we have a responsibility to figure out what is the highest and best use of all of those resources. One of the things that I've heard in my conversations with literally like the few thousand Lemon Grove residents that I've talked to over the past couple of months, knocking on doors, calling people, talking on the phone, is traffic is a bigger problem than crime for a lot of people. And the traffic enforcement component is really significant as well. One of my suggestions would be, as we begin to renegotiate this contract, baking into that piece, mandating a degree of training and engagement around community conscious policing, around building those relationships. But at the same time, not all deputies are created equal just from a function of their job duties themselves. So perhaps part of what Lemon Grove wants is more traffic deputies than patrol deputies per se. Perhaps we can save costs with motorcycle deputies on top of that, where the half-life of their service vehicle is a fraction of what it is in the SUV or in the car. Motorcycle costs less. You know, at the end of the day, we have a financial responsibility as well to keep people safe, protected, comfortable, all of these things. But it's also become clear that we're asking police to do things that they're simply not equipped to do. And how can we, as a community, not as one or two individuals, but as a community, come together and have some candid, vulnerable, and frank conversations about all of these pieces and figure out if there is a better way, what would that look like? I'm gonna throw a couple of other quick stats at people, that I want to open it up for questions that anyone might have for Mr. Lee. This is referencing the recent work done in Imperial Beach, another one of the 9 cities that contract with the Sheriff's Department. And I think it's really relevant because they're similar size to Lemon Grove. We got about 25,000 people. IB has 27,000 people. We're a town of 4 square miles or 3.9 square miles. They got about 4.5 square miles. We have 21 deputies. They have 23 deputies. Our 2019-2020 fiscal year budget for law enforcement is about 6.2 million. It's currently about 5.6 in IB. So just right off the top, you know, without having all of the information about the IB budget, you know, they've got 2 more deputies and they're paying about 600,000 less than us. Okay, that's interesting. I think it's something worth looking at. But it's also important to remember that each year until the current sheriff's contract expires in June of 2022, the budget expenditure goes up about 5.5%. So in 2021, it'll be 6.5 million. And by the time it's done in 2022, we're looking at 6.8 million. So again, when things are falling apart around us, we're looking at a structural deficit. I find it absolutely irresponsible that we don't look at the largest line item in that budget. And one of the largest systems that I think is wrapped up in a number of other functions that have very real public health components to them, and that public safety is really public health more than anything. I would put forth the argument that crime, the thing that we expect police to respond to, is primarily a function of poverty and a lack of access and opportunity. And if we're able to address poverty to the extent that we can within, you know, the borders of our tiny town, if we can address access and opportunity, we can begin to reduce the load that we're trying to place on law enforcement and simply throwing stuff at them and saying, solve this for us. A couple of the other interesting things that I think are relevant, again, from this IB study, the city council there found that the sheriff's department's available data was essentially unacceptable, and improvements are absolutely necessary to allow cities to study law enforcement concerns, and it needs to be vastly and expeditiously improved, you know, their language. They said the sheriff's department there could not provide localized data about use of force complaints, nor could they provide any data about racial disparities, saying, we collect that county-wide, so we can't give you anything community-specific. If we're paying $6 million a year for law enforcement, I think it's absurd that we can't get that same type of data. So these are things that we should be looking into. The ad hoc committee that they put together there also looked at, you know, the creation of a community service officer to respond in certain situations. You know, an officer that's unarmed, uniformed personnel, trained to respond to non-emergency situations and to be out in the community on a regular basis, and a starting point for more community-based policing. Here's another interesting statistic that I think, if you're anything like me, it should frustrate you as well. Over the last 5 years, 90% of the 55,000 911 calls were non-emergency calls, meaning that they were non-violent in nature. So what we're also saying is we're paying $6 million, but about 90% of the people that we believe are trained to respond to our needs when things are at their worst, 90% of what they were doing wasn't what they were actually trained to do. I imagine that being like if you hired a contractor to come to your house to redo your kitchen, and you laid out a budget and a scope of work and a timetable and a plan, but he's out in the front yard doing your landscaping and telling you about your pool. You're like, hey, man, that's not what I asked you to do. We need to work on the kitchen. You know, we have a specific set of things that we need you to get done here. So really what this is about is what is the right tool for the job at every level. And if we look at the sheriff's contract, there's a minimum level of staffing that the sheriff's department requires. And for Lemon Grove, essentially that's one 24-hour, 7-day-a-week patrol deputy, and at minimum, a traffic deputy that's there 8.5 hours a day and 7 days a week. I'm not saying that we should have the minimum level of staffing from the sheriff, but I'm saying that's the starting point. That should be the building block that we begin to scale up and figure out what is it we need at every level along the way. We're paying for helicopters, we're paying for the bomb unit, we're paying for the SWAT unit. I understand we might want these things when we need them. When was the last time that they were used? How often have they been deployed? What other options are available? Jumping from the city of IB to the city of Del Mar, going all the way back to 2010, elected officials there have, been farsighted enough to see the cost breaking out of containment for their city and recognize that it wasn't sustainable and began to put some studies together to see what could be done. We won't be able to get into all of it today, but I'll definitely put some links up because it's really, really interesting. They looked into a number of things. One, a current evaluation of their law enforcement services as they exist, an evaluation of the spectrum of alternative policing measures. Now, mind you, this is way before anyone was talking about at least using vocabulary that sounded like defunding police or other pieces like that. They did some of the math to look and see what if the city of Del Mar had a standalone police department. I think that's something that we should at least explore here in Lemon Grove while we have this 2-year window prior to the renegotiation of this contract. Other things they looked at were the creation of a police special district. They looked at a joint powers authority. There are a number of alternatives to the current model that we have that I believe we should explore. Another potential asset that we may have in Lemon Grove that some of the North County cities don't have is we have the city of La Mesa right next door to us. And we have the city of San Diego as well. When was the last time that someone did a deep study and analysis of what it would look like to contract with the city of La Mesa for law enforcement, or to contract with the city of San Diego? Or then again, to look at having Lemon Grove's own standalone police force that's based uniquely on the needs of the community. So these are the things that I think we should be exploring. At the very least, one of the things we should have as soon as possible is the creation of some type of oversight committee, a community sheriff's oversight committee that's able to look at data, that's able to look at response times, that's able to look in detail at how these sheriffs are spending their time. And if upwards of 70–75% of everything they're being asked to do has a mental health component, a substance abuse component, or a component related to homelessness, and these are the 3 biggest things that they really can't address. So what would it look like to redirect and reallocate those resources to be more impactful and to get more of the outcomes that we're looking for, and to actually create the public health and the public safety that we all require, and really make law enforcement's jobs and lives easier, to make their job and profession safer in many respects. It's interesting, we have Mr. Lee here, who's up in the Pacific Northwest. The city of Eugene, Oregon, where I actually went to college, has rolled out an alternative policing program called Cahoots, where there's a nonprofit that the Eugene Police Department contracts with, and they respond to calls involving mental illness, homelessness, addiction, welfare checks, suicide threats. And it's someone, they respond in a team with, a medic and a crisis worker who's also trained in mental health treatment. The program takes up 2% of the police department's budget, but responds to roughly 20% of the emergency calls. So that's an incredible savings right off the top, in addition to the community benefit and the the de-escalation factor that's wound up in that as well, that I find to be tremendously powerful. Before I pass it back to Mr. Lee or open it up, I did want to recognize another guest that we had on the call with us, and I believe I mentioned her earlier, Ms. Sharon Sampson. Ms. Sampson, I'm going to let you talk about yourself and the work that you do, but if we could go ahead and get you off mute, Ms. Sampson. Ms. Sampson is joining us from the Community College District, and I think that's an even more important relationship that we need to think about how we're interacting with and how we're leveraging. As Lemon Grove residents, about 25 cents of every property tax dollar goes to the Community College District. So they're already stakeholders in Lemon Grove, whether we see it that way or they see it that way or not. And we should be finding every opportunity we possibly can to collaborate. And while I don't think you have an answer for this right now, Ms. Sampson or Brian, one of the things I've talked about is how can we get a satellite or something like that in this community here, turn Grossmont Community College, you know, get some type of adult education center going, turn you into a tenant, an anchor tenant paying rent in a storefront somewhere. Let's work it out. But with that, Ms. Sampson, take it away. Tell us something about yourself, about the work that you're doing, and welcome.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's an absolute pleasure to meet you. Hopefully you can hear me clearly.
You are good.
I am actually using my cell phone. My internet is being spotty today, so I'm actually using my phone. So I do apologize for not being able to be on video. And regarding the question you just posed, to have a satellite in Lemon Grove and to partner and to further and deepen that collaborative effort, I would like to actually invite you as a guest speaker on our campus. So I'm going to respond to a question and put it back in your court to see if you would be amenable to actually coming and engaging in full dialogue with all of the powers to be in our campus. So we can coordinate, I can contact your folks and to see what would be best to move forward so we can definitely deepen that alliance. So absolutely, it's a pleasure listening to the presentation this evening. I did post it and I did not do it in a sufficient time, but I promise, based on my colleagues' inability to be present today, you will get an opportunity to be on that platform where you can share this information virtually. And thanks, Brian.
You're welcome. I'm so glad you're here tonight. I just kind of follow up what Sharon was just talking about. We work together at Grossmont College. I am the chair of the Theater Arts Department. She's faculty in the Administration of Justice Department. And we sit together on the President's Task Force on Anti-Racism and a couple of other things. We're senators together. And this is a conversation that is very important to us at the college because we also at the college do not have a local police department at the college. We have a relationship with the Sheriff Department. And I saw a couple of questions about PERT stuff in here. I have to be honest, the idea of PERT is fantastic. It has not played out well for at least me and my experience with my students in the arts at the college. It was actually, I was taken aback by how the PERT officer with a pink badge treated a woman who was suicidal on my campus. I almost got up and walked her out of the situation. It was that bad. But I stuck around. So Sharon is one of my favorite human beings on campus. The work that we are doing together is amazing, and I'm so glad we're having this conversation. So I'm going to turn that over. I've got a couple questions, though, if we wanted to take some questions. I am looking forward to having all of you, the T4T organization, Kamaal, let's get on campus and talk a little bit because we've got some things about to start next week that we're all a little edgy about. So anyway, the first question, I'll take these in order. Jess and Eric, hi guys, welcome. I was glad to see you show up. It's nice to see you. And the question they have is they'd like to know a little bit about how much of the city budget goes to the helicopter. It flies over almost daily, sometimes multiple times a day, in an unintelligible to boot. So they need some speaker equipment. But what kind of cost does come out of our budget for that, or is that more the city? Or I mean, the county?
So that's an excellent question, and it's one of the questions that I've, as of yet, been unable to get clear data There are a number of services that are laid out in the sheriff's contract that are provided essentially as an adjunct. And then there are some other kind of ancillary fees. There's some overhead fees and some other pieces that are kind of built into the way the system works. I don't know if it would take, you know, a Public Records Act request, or if it would simply take the opportunity to engage in deeper and more meaningful dialogue with the Sheriff's Department to be able to get access to those figures specifically. But as of this moment, I've been unable to determine what exactly that cost is, what it costs to operate a helicopter. The fact that we have 9 cities in the county who all contract with the Sheriff's Department does help to spread that burden and load. And I believe there are some benefits to like that consortium, so to speak. At the same time, there are other hindrances because we're unable to often negotiate and have the type of local control that we really want. Out of those 9 cities, they make up about 52% of the entire Sheriff's Department's budget. So I think there are a number of things that we can't necessarily take or pay for a la carte, nor would we want to, right? Like, let's use the example of, and I think I might have talked about this before, the Del Taco, where there was a gentleman, there was an obvious mental health issue, but he had a pistol and he showed up in the Del Taco waving it. And fortunately, no other, you know, residents were hurt. This is maybe 2 years ago. I don't want a social worker to show up at Del Taco when somebody's there with a pistol, right? But I think an important question, or another important question, not simply ensuring that we have an armed response to that, is how do we get to a point where a person's mental health had reached a degree where now they're wandering the streets with a pistol and they're able to enter a Del Taco? I think that's a more important question, kind of the precursor to that. And what are we doing to address those gaps in services? I think COVID has laid even more bare regarding the very thin social safety network that exists. We've seen so many people lose jobs. We've seen so many people who are already unstable lose housing. And while we're seeing the murmurings and the sputterings of a recovery, we're definitely not out of the woods yet. But these are problems that existed long prior to COVID and undoubtedly will persist afterwards. Data is going to be important. And unless we're able as a city to come together with the Lemon Grove community and demand a greater degree of transparency from the practices of data and record keeping in the Sheriff's Department, it's going to be even harder for us to really get down to the foundation of the piece and begin to build back up from scratch. And I believe that the window of time that we have to do it is perfect. IB, they took 90 days to put together, you know, I think they had 5 public meetings and an ad hoc committee. And they were also ready to admit that they are nowhere near having all of the information that they need, but they're one of the first cities in the county to begin taking some of these steps at a time when the city of San Diego, city of Chula Vista, city of Oceanside increased their their law enforcement budgets. IB was one of the cities to say, hey, let's pause, take a step back and see what else we could be doing. And let's get all the information available. And I think that's exactly what we should be doing right here in Lemon Grove.
Great question. That was a good answer for all of that too. So this question is for Brandon, actually. How do you determine the cases that you support for advocacy?
That's a great question. You know, so number one, we feel as though we bring 3 things to the table, which is lived experience of having been racially profiled and how to redress those situations, how to heal from those situations, advocacy for other civil rights, and then obviously the training component. So I always am available, whatever local community that I'm in or living in, I'm always available for community members who are impacted. So even today, I mean, I'll get a couple of calls I got a couple of calls today from a couple of a woman from East Africa and another woman who was biracial from a rural town in Oregon. So I'm always fielding advocacy calls. And a lot of times it's really to just help bring clarity to a circumstance. I am not an attorney. I do not give legal advice, but my major, one of them, is public policy, policy that serves the common good. And so I really don't have a criteria as far as advocacy because we're here to serve the public. Where I do have a criteria is with law enforcement organizations that we partner with. That's where we're very strict. So for those who want to engage with T4T as far as a law enforcement organization, there are criteria that we'd like for them to meet. So for example, we're going to ask questions such as who accredits that agency? Some departments are accredited, which means that they have, most are accredited. It's a matter of what level of accreditation do they have? Is it federally accredited? Is it accredited local? So that determines what they're tracking, how much they're tracking. Are they tracking the bare minimum? Are they tracking even more to be even, even more progressive? So those are the questions that we look for. Have they had any type of issues in the community related to, using violence, law enforcement violence against the community in a certain period of time before we get to talk? So there's certain criteria that we have in place that's more structured for law enforcement organizations that we partner with. But in terms of community and advocacy, we're here to serve. I don't, the number on my website is my cell number. So, I don't go around waving that around to everybody, but we make sure that we're available to the public and specifically those who are impacted the most by this type of circumstances.
It's great. Great.
Go
ahead.
So I'll make this really quick. So I want to be mindful of time and make sure that everyone has a chance to answer their questions. I did want to touch on, I was Retention and Multicultural Center Coordinator for the Multicultural Center at Portland Community College. And in that role, I know from my engagement with the police department on campus, some of the insights that I discovered was I had to redress a sergeant on campus, the only one that was allowed to wear a gun. Or have a gun, and we had to redress him. So the law enforcement on campus, none of them had to participate in any of the professional development trainings that we had to. So if we had diversity trainings or if we had leadership development trainings or things like that, they were exempt. So even if we were progressing on the campus as a collective, the police were still off doing their own thing. And so there would be times where we would have to intervene for the sake of our students. And then the second point that I wanted to make was I was fortunate to serve on what's called the Law Enforcement Data Collection and Policy Review Committee. It's a governor-appointed committee in Oregon whose role is all about stop data. When you're stopped by the police, all of this needs to be recorded. And at the end of the year, who is analyzing all of this data to determine if racial profiling exists? So even if you got to get localized data for your city, there's still a lot of work that has to be done that has to inform that data for the researchers. And so what we discovered was it was a lot easier to just go hire our Black doctor researchers to do our own statistics, because I was spending too much time informing the researcher of the numbers that they were actually looking at. So I do concur. I'm not here to get involved in politics, but I do believe that we have a process to bring people who are most impacted by racial profiling and police misconduct to the table with the decision makers who make the decisions that impact our daily experience, right? And I think that's the process that's usually missing. It's usually academic researchers, attorneys, and law enforcement leaders who decide how we get treated on the street. And until we get a voice at the architectural table, then a lot of efforts are just, they're just busy work. So.
We have a couple questions, but there was a very interesting statement you made there that kind of relates back to some of the work Sharon and I are doing from kind of her own department, actually. We, after Breonna Taylor's death and George Floyd's death, when we hit this in the middle of the pandemic, the college decided that we were going to take our faculty professional development in a certain direction for the fall. And I reached out to a couple of people, Sharon being one, and some other folks in her department in AOJ, the Administration of Justice, to join us. And the response I got was, "No, we'll do our own thing, thank you." And I think that's common. I think that the rest of us are doing certain professional development in our lives and personal development, and this over here is not doing that same thing. And I think there's a disconnect there. So thank you for mentioning that. Just out of curiosity, because Sharon and I work with a woman named Lita Raffia, who was at Portland Community College for a while. Do you know Lita at all?
She's the homie. Yes.
Oh,
we all paid dues together, man. Make sure you tell her I said hello. Yeah, we were in the trenches together out here. Much love and peace and blessings. She's an incredible talent.
She is. She is. All right, cool. Next question. Would it be more cost effective to have our own police department? And if we did, wouldn't it be easier to control reform measures and implement community policing efforts?
So that's another fantastic question. And I can't say with certainty whether or not it would be more cost effective for us. What the city of Del Mar found is that it was not more cost effective for them. However, having a standalone police department would allow for a higher level of service, for a higher degree of control over reform, training, and these other practices, in addition to the real nitty-gritty level of detail that you're looking for in terms of embedding law enforcement staff within the community itself. There are some startup costs that we would inevitably incur if we decided to go that route. And I think it's premature for anyone to say what the tack is that we should take. But I think the course that we should put ourselves upon now is commissioning these studies. And the way Del Mar did it is, I think, the way that it should be done, in that we shouldn't lean on staff to do this work. Let's commission an outside expert to come in to take the time. You know, we have 2.5 years before we have to renegotiate this contract. One of the first things that I would do when we get elected in November, right after we put together that resident-led economic development committee, is a Lemon Grove Sheriff's Oversight Committee to begin to take the first steps, put out an RFQ or an RFP for someone to do this type of work, have some other community convenings and conversations about what are the questions where we really want answered. What does minimum staffing look like? And what other options are at our disposal, right? So I think we should look out and game out the cost benefit analysis of a standalone police department, as well as potentially partnering with the city of San Diego, as well as potentially partnering with the city of La Mesa, as well as a joint powers authority. Could there be a Lemon Grove, Spring Valley, Bonita force or something like that? One of the other interesting pieces about the joint powers authority alternative is it removes a lot of the pension costs. They're sworn officers, but it would essentially be an entirely new level and layer of government, which also presents its own unique complications, right? This is something that LAFCO would have to vote on. This is something where essentially it would become a new cadre of elected officials who are now in charge of this joint powers authority. So even with that, there are things that we would gain, but things that we would lose, because again, right off the top, we'd be giving up some of that local control to a brand new set of elected officials. So I don't pretend to have all of the answers in this area, but I think I have a good idea of where we should begin to start to gather information, to learn from cities around us who have already taken some of these steps, but also, again, to look at our unique location and proximity to other cities. There may be things that pencil out for us in Lemon Grove that simply don't pencil out for the smaller cities further up north, or for IB, where they're cut off from a few people in terms of their proximity to the coast and other pieces like that. So right off the top, I can say, I think it's safe to assume that having a standalone police department would start off as more expensive, but the extent to which we can recoup those costs after a number of years remains to be seen and is worth exploring.
We have a question from Tanya Miss Harris. I actually know the answer to this, so if you don't, I'm happy to answer it because I just had this conversation with a group of them the other night. How many of our sheriffs in Lemon Grove are residents of Lemon Grove?
I don't know that answer. Please, I'd love to know.
That
Zero.
many. So I've been having conversations with trying to have conversations with the leadership with fire and sheriff about their choice for mayor in the city, which I do not agree with whatsoever. And one of the questions I asked the police officers, the sheriff's officers at our night out the other night at Sprouts, was how could they have a say in the mayor in this town when I don't know that any of you live here? And I said, how many of you live in the city? And the response I got was, no police officer should ever live in the community they police. Because would you want to live next door to the guy you arrest? And I said, that's crazy. How do you get to know the community you police? And I got a bunch of guys turned around and didn't want to have the rest of the conversation.
Welcome to my work.
So, I literally thought just now, I was like, I wonder if you run into this experience. Because this kind of tacks on to something that Brandon just said in the chat. He said, you're talking about non-armed police patrols, right? I know in parts of London, the cops who patrol without guns live in the community and they know everybody there. Anyway, I'll turn that back over to you for your thoughts on that. But I just had that conversation the other night with a bunch of officers.
So, that's a great point. So everything that you're touching on are things that we've encountered along the way. So, again, back to our origins, before I got to work for anybody else, I didn't go into the case, but I was fortunate to have settled a lawsuit against the police department for police misconduct that resulted in a monetary settlement and disciplinary actions against the officers. Even the story I share with you coming from the NAACP. So if you notice, we're kind of defensively driven, which means that most of our conversations began with an accountability conversation. And all of our trainings happened because either we could go this accountability route, and luckily the departments who fit the criteria that I was kind of walking you all through before, they had been doing some positive work. They weren't perfect, but they had been moving in this direction. And so they recognized the opportunity that we brought and they took advantage. And they used us as a third party to kind of triangulate and take them from scenario-based training into actual real life engagement. And so when I would hear things like, I don't live in the city, I was told the same thing, I recognize where they're coming from. But before this generation of officers, I remember a generation of officers. So for example, my best friend in Oakland, his uncle or great whatever was the first Black police officer in Oakland. That's the generation that our people come from. So there was a time when, you police the area you from. You do. And that dynamic brings a different level of engagement when you do have deep community connections and you can't just get away with whatever. And so I'll say this and then I'll digress. Before we go and have a conversation with law enforcement, community conscious policing is a public health response model to ending law enforcement violence. With that being said, it is based off a curriculum that we authored, community conscious leadership. So what we do is help law enforcement, leadership and law enforcement shift their approach to problem solving. If they're still operating, trying to address problem solving from a 1980s Excel spreadsheet, statistics, IQ perspective, implicit bias, pretty soon we're going to have an accountability conversation. So we have to help them shift their approach to problem solving to the 21st century to even be able to understand or comprehend what we need them to take on. So the leadership is where we begin, and we don't do anything until the sheriff himself, herself, themself, or the chief himself, herself, themself actually participate in the training themselves and set the tone. So I'll say this tonight, so I'll say this and then I'll digress. But I'm a fraternal guy. I'm pledged historically Black fraternities and organizations. So I understand fraternal culture. I understand the good old boy network. I'm from that. So I'm not a police officer, but I do understand the hierarchy. And so, some things for some officers just need to be told how we want to engage. You know, there's times to ask questions, and then there's times like right now to where it's not about no questions right now. It's about what we want to see, and you know, we can have the community building conversation, or we can have the accountability conversation. But the result, none of us are going back this way. So.
Another question, Alicia, I'm going to kind of combine two things that she asked and then a statement. She said, I definitely support figuring out how to reallocate our funds to the correct services, but is it possible for our sheriff department to bring in some of their own money? Perhaps we hire a meter maid for parking enforcement, create new laws that prohibit residents to park their non-operating cars on city streets for months at a time. Also thinking about parking meters. And then I'll wrap this up with, I also think that if we were able to find a way to open our rec center, we can begin to educate our community and children about some of these social injustice issues, community safety, et cetera. We need a space for that.
So yes, yes, and yes, right? On the code enforcement piece, I think that goes hand in hand with city staff, or a city that's appropriately and effectively staffed. There's almost zero code enforcement going on in the city of Lemon Grove right now because it's a bandwidth issue. The city doesn't have the money to allocate to additional staff to perform those functions. And what also happens is there's revenue that we lose out as a result of those pieces. I think there are a number of parallel tracks that we can engage on throughout this process and period of inquiry to include code enforcement, to include parking and other pieces like that. I think Lemon Grove is still a few years away from having paid parking meters, but I do think they are going to be in our future, especially as I think about opportunities to revitalize our downtown, village area. It may be unpopular, but if people begin to see the improvements in road health and safety, amongst other things, I think they'll be much more amenable to these types of changes, even though culturally it may be a bit jarring at first. And in many respects, having to pay for parking means you live in a nice part of town, or at least certain parts of that town. And additionally, like you said, one of the delightfully quaint things about our semi-rural community is that some folks be having a whole lot of cars out on their front lawn, out in front of their house. And part of the reason that happens, I believe, is also because streets aren't paved properly and there aren't nearly enough sidewalks. And if there were sidewalks, people simply wouldn't be parked in those spaces. And we do have a lot of multi-generational homes and families in Lemon Grove. And, you got mom, dad, granny, grandpa, a couple of kids going to school, a couple of kids driving other kids to school. You might end up with 6, 7, 8 cars before you know it. And it's a blessing to live in a place like Lemon Grove where you may have a big enough house and a big enough lot to accommodate extended family in these pieces. And I don't want to get in the way of that. At the same time, I also recognize there are some public nuisance components to that work, right? If you have, you're the shade tree mechanic and you're out working on your Chevy, on the street as opposed to in your driveway or in your front yard, or there are 6 or 7 cars that you kind of turn your house into an informal mechanic and garage shop. Those are the types of things that we probably don't want to see happening. And the extent to which we're able to create a code enforcement team and response and build some culture around that as we roll it out. So it's not just something we spring on people. It's not something we're trying to put people in a trick bag and catch you slipping. But there are things that we do want to protect. There are things that we do want to normalize and standardize as part of how we envision our town growing, improving, and then the impacts that again will have, property values, people's health and safety, and all these pieces. So they're definitely connected.
Great. Another question. Tanya and I were chatting a bit in the chat about the kind of fairness of allowing, and maybe it's not unfair, I don't know, allowing the police and firefighters unions to post their support all over this town when they don't even live here. That's odd to me. You know, but election laws are what they are, and you know, it is what it is. But she does have a question. Do you agree we have a problem with speeding? And I believe if we had more presence of a speed gun, that would be a win. Speeding drivers are fined and would slow down drivers on speeding streets. I know this is a huge concern for us too. We live on Madera. We are the speedway between Lemon Grove and Encanto, you know, and there's an elementary school 2 doors up. So yeah, quite curious.
Absolutely. I actually had a conversation with Brandon about this not too long ago. And I think we were aligned in that I'm generally not in that group of people who's inclined to offer up their freedoms and civil liberties for a degree of safety. At the same time, I do think we live in an era where we have advanced technologically to the point where, specifically with traffic safety, speed sections, other kind of LiDAR readers and some of the cutting edge stuff that's out there, I think these are exactly the types of things that we should be exploring to deploy in Lemon Grove. While those things all have costs and have to be maintained and kept up, and you know, the life cycle of those things will have to be replaced, almost inevitably, they're still more inexpensive year to year than an actual human traffic deputy. And these are exactly the types of things that we need to be kind of gaming out and doing an analysis of to see. And I think school zones would be an ideal section to begin. They have technology now where, you know, there's no facial camera or anything involved. All it is a license plate reader and some type of GPS transponder, where as soon as you enter a section, even if multiple vehicles enter the section, they could do it on singular lanes, on dual lanes, they could do it at intersections. Each car can be tracked for any violation of speed within that area. And essentially you get a ticket pinged to, you know, whatever address or, you know, is connected to the registration on that vehicle. I think that could go a long way to start to build some behavioral changes, starting with school zones and kind of building outwards to some of the other larger thoroughfares that are speed traps in Lemon Grove. Again, as we go back to the minimum staffing required in Lemon Grove and start to build up, maybe we find that we need 5, 6, 7, 8 traffic deputies so that we can start to post them up on Madera, on San Miguel, on Federal, on these other streets that have reputations for being dangerous, and begin to create the type of safety that we need. So I think a combination of an exploration of technology, in addition to, then this shouldn't be left out of the conversation, safety by design itself, right? As we're working to pave roads, as we're working to do other things, what are the lower hanging fruit that we can implement from an engineering perspective, from a public works perspective? Sometimes just striping the roads in a different pattern causes people to change their relationship to speed. Oftentimes narrowing lanes causes people to reduce speeds moving through communities. So these are all the types of things that we should be looking at. And again, in the conversations that I've been having, as well as the conversations that I've been hearing about, people talk more about traffic enforcement than they do about crime in Lemon Grove. Yeah, we have crime. Every place has crime. And there are certain things you can do about it, and there are certain things you can't do about certain types of things. But I believe you absolutely can do things about traffic, and the extent to which we can do everything we can to make this community as safe as possible is exactly what we should be doing.
If I could toss really, oops.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just really quickly, one, based on my research, you also do the exploration yourselves for sure. But in certain areas, they'll add more officers for traffic. In certain areas, they might add speed bumps for traffic. In the rich areas, they just put that speed thing. They're not gonna mail you a ticket. They just gonna put a real big how fast you're driving. So there are things that even, you know, institutions understand that there are ways to get messages across, and there is bias in terms of where certain modes are implemented. And so, you know, one example, they did I'm not one that's for giving up my civil liberties in exchange for perceived safety, but just an example, they did like a high crime area. You can put all the police you want to. It's not gonna stop the crime. But they put not just a camera, I don't even know if it was active, but just a sign that said, this area is now being watched. The crime went down. But the police presence didn't do that, right? So that's where we have to shift our approach to problem solving before we can even really get engaged into these conversations, because it's our old outdated way of thinking and approaching that, especially with our millennial generation and students. You know, I grew up playing remote control cars. My son grew up flying drones.
That's right.
3D space, completely different, right? And so that's why, you know, shifting our approach to problem solving, that's where I always begin, you know, in terms of the work.
I actually have a question, but I want to comment on that real quick. I love to think that I live in a rich area of Lemon Grove. I don't think I do. I mean, I paid too damn much for a house here, but I have 2 speed signs on my street, one going this way and one going that way, and they don't do shit. They do nothing. But because of that, I called the sheriff multiple times to get that, because we have a school 4 houses down from us and people just like blow through it. So I call a lot. What we have in this city, and this is my question, involves the community service officer we have. So we have a service officer. He is an older white man. I am the only family on my street. The live next door to me are 2 young black guys in the military, and surrounded by Hispanic families. And we have a fire hydrant in front of our house. There's a 15-foot marker, which is the telephone pole. There's no red curb, just no sign, nothing, right? This dude comes over. He drives right by when my wife's car is parked there, creeping in. But every time that the Dimitri, we call them, because they're both named Dimitri, they live next door. Every time they're working on their car in the driveway and they have a car parked in front of the hydrant, he tickets them. Now, he and I do not have a good relationship because of that, because I've called him out every time he pulls up. We have a very uncomfortable conversation. So I started calling the sheriff's department. And the answer I got, and I thought this was interesting, so I'm curious to know, Kamaal, as mayor especially, how you would handle this with the sheriff's department. The answer I got was kind of a laugh from the people who answered the phone. And they said, oh, he's kind of an originalist. He kind of sticks to the letter of the law. Like, it was funny. And I said, so are you telling me that the department really doesn't, but you allow this person to? Well, he's acting within the right of the law. And my jaw hit the floor, because I think we all know where originalism is kind of getting us right now. I've watched any of the Supreme Court nominations this week. That concerns me. So how do we address a community service officer who's out writing tickets when he could simply get out of his truck and say, hey, guys, I know you're working on your car. Can you move this down 10 feet? It's that simple. How do we address that? And then Leanna wanted to say hi.
I think one possible step to address something like that would be the creation of a Lemon Grove Community Sheriff's Oversight Committee, right?
Just did this week.
The role of that committee wouldn't simply be to help lead some of the work and research around the funding pieces, around alternative response methodology and practices. It would also be to create some form of accountability within the department to address those pieces specifically. Who watches the watchman is always one of the questions, right? And unless there is a body locally that's accountable to residents, composed of residents, I don't know how else that's going to happen, right? Short of having someone in the department that you rely on to do the right thing all the time in all cases. And I think anytime you're relying on one person or leadership and kind of that bottleneck to resolve and address your grievances, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. But the extent to which we can share that responsibility, and so that the accountability is not simply to those 1, 2, 3, or 10 people in the community who are more active than others, but a body that's accountable to residents, that's able to have some teeth in its interactions with that department as well. And while we're on the topic of the reserve deputies, I think that also presents another opportunity to provide some of the coverage and perceptions of safety that we're looking for in an expansion of the reserve deputy program. And you know, it doesn't always have to be somebody who was a sheriff and is now retired, but to what extent, again, we don't necessarily need sworn armed officers everywhere. Sometimes the presence of somebody in a uniform, some folks may remember the park rangers we used to have in Lemon Grove. To what extent can we bring something like that back? To what extent can we create some type of downtown ambassador, like we've seen in Little Italy in downtown San Diego, where this is a person who, you know, they're not here to stop crime. And I suppose if you're a real criminal, you weren't tripping on the sheriffs being there. You're definitely not tripping on the park ranger or the downtown ambassador. But there are other benefits to having a visible presence there and someone who can address things or some of those other enforcement measures. So again, I would try and create a body that consists of residents, that has some power and has a direct line of communication within the sheriff's department, but also not just something where, oh, the citizens committee had a complaint, let's let it blow over or, you know, laugh it off. How do we set up the process so that there's some accountability and, you know, some reckoning that goes on as well within that, so we don't have people kind of freestyling out there taking broad interpretations of the letter of the law at their convenience.
Great. I know we've only got a few minutes left, but I know Leanne LeBaron is here with us tonight, who is running for city council, and she's been listening to this conversation, and I just wanted to unmute her and say hello, and she had some thoughts. Hold on here. There you go. Hi.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to put my camera on too. Hi. Hope I'm not scaring anyone tonight. My name's Leanne LeBaron. I'm running for Lemon Grove City Council. I just wanted to, not that that's important. This is the Kamaal show. Kamaal's awesome. I had some comments. So actually, I've been going door to door because I'm running for city council. So I'm doing a lot of door to door, talking to people, like literally talking to a lot of people. And going into this, I knew that there were certain top concerns in the community. I didn't know until I started knocking on doors and talking to everybody. I didn't know that one of people's like really top concerns is traffic enforcement. Like it's huge. I want to say like most people when I ask them, hey, you know, I'm running for city council, what are your concerns with the city of Lemon Grove? Tell me. Most of them say traffic enforcement. And as I'm walking, because I know we're talking about traffic enforcement deputies and stuff, and the effectiveness of flashing signs versus actual deputy presence. I do have some thoughts on that. I mean, I haven't done a scientific study, but I want to say an actual deputy being posted up, parked somewhere with a radar gun, or just being parked somewhere, like observing, is more effective than a flashing sign for people being on their best behavior when they're driving. And again, I will say that actually a lot of people that I'm talking to are saying that they want more, which I didn't know this going in, you know, given the climate that we're in right now. People are asking for more deputy presence, like a lot of the people. And I'm talking about Democrats, Republicans, young, old. My survey isn't necessarily scientific, but yeah, I'd say I'm getting pretty much across the board. People want more deputy presence for things like enforcing traffic, because they feel like Lemon Grove has a sense of like not lawlessness, kind of like nobody cares to respect the traffic rules, and that affects an individual in the sense that they don't feel safe pulling out of their driveway or walking the streets because people are just blowing stop signs or speeding on certain streets. So traffic enforcement. And then I want to also say that I'm also making note of some of the worst streets in Lemon Grove and some of the most dangerous streets. And actually I am flabbergasted. I walked San Miguel maybe like 2 weeks ago. I'm flabbergasted that that street, the western side of San Miguel, hasn't been fixed yet, actually. So I've gone to city council meetings where people have, groups of neighbors from that area have gone to city council and complained about the safety of that street. I mean, and of course, there have even been deaths on San Miguel. And after walking that street, yeah, I'm totally, I'm really actually pretty appalled that that street hasn't been fixed already. It is insanely dangerous, like insanely dangerous. The street is, not only is it like geographically, it's tricky and dangerous. There's many curves, blind hills. The street is narrow. There's nowhere to walk on the side of the street, and the sides of the street are literally crumbling to pieces. I'm a 30-year-old woman, and I was scared I was going to be and I'm smart, and I'm like looking all around, and I was literally scared I was going to get hit and run over and killed on San Miguel. So that kind of goes to like traffic and safety. And a lot of the people on that street, San Miguel and MacArthur, they all want there to be deputies there making sure people are following the traffic rules, like just sitting there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got about
Would be a
2.5
deterrent.
minutes left for us to wrap up.
That's
So
it. That's all.
sorry to jump in. Yeah, my son goes to school over there. I mean, the whole city is like that. But I want to give Kamaal just an opportunity to kind of wrap us up here. This has been an excellent conversation. I am so grateful that we had this tonight. Before Kamaal gets to thank them, I would just like to thank our guest this evening. What a joy to have both of you here and hear your perspectives on the issue. And I'm going to pass this back to Kamaal. We've got one more in 2 weeks. We're going to talk about placemaking and what that means and how we can make the place better. But I'm going to flip that over back to Kamaal, let him take us home. And I really appreciate it.
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for attending. I wanted to thank our guests for joining us for a really, really important conversation that's going to take all of us collectively to address. And everybody who's on the call can talk to me anytime they want, but I'd like Ms. Sampson and Mr. Lee to, close out with any other final remarks, and we can wrap up there. Ms. Sampson?
Thank you for the opportunity, Kamaal. It's been a pleasure listening to all the insight. I'm looking forward to you being a true leader in taking the helms of Lemon Grove. I am not a resident, but I do have a firm investment because I do have my students and my fellow colleagues who reside in your city. So my takeaway from this evening is that there's much work to be done. And I hear that with the concern about the law enforcement, the budget, and how much investment financially it's taking out of the city and what resources can be in place of supporting the sheriff to come up with best strategies to improve the lives of all of those in the surrounding areas, and of course, the most important, residents of Lemon Grove. So I really would like to see you come and make a presentation at Grossmont to further this conversation, to build that bridge and those relationships that we have since we're neighbors and we share the same area. So I would like to open up that floor and provide that opportunity. I am a faculty in the Administrative Justice Department. So this, I have a foot in both worlds. I am sensitive because I do have relatives who are still active law enforcement officials. But the same token, I am of African American descent, and the trauma and the experience of all of my people, we're all experiencing it together. So we really would like to see that bridge being built and to consider all sides. I can't be blind to the fact that we need law enforcement in our communities, but I also know that law enforcement are there to protect and serve, and part of that mission is forgotten most of the time. So you mentioned that there are great officers and there are those who have forgotten their place. And we need to provide those continued opportunities to have that open dialogue and to provide that space where the community and law enforcement can come together and build that bridge. So I'm looking forward to meeting you again virtually at some form on our side at Grossmont, and at some point personally, to have us continue this dialogue on a different level. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining us and adding to the conversation. Mr. Lee, any closing comments? And you can go ahead and wrap us up and send us home.
Sure, I'll make this brief. I'm the author, I'm sure we've already talked about it, Best Practices in Community Conscious Policing, and in it there is 25, thank you, sir, right? There are 25 recommendations along civilian oversight of police, models around the country in regards to public health responses to law enforcement violence. And we have a third edition that'll be coming out that will build on our training and accountability, but include healing from the trauma of police, and that'll be out very soon. I just want to thank everyone again for inviting me into your space. And the last thing I want to end on is just very rarely do I participate in certain events around politics just because of our focus. But I want everybody on this call to know that my personal relationship with Kamaal, this is probably one of the first times we've ever talked business because I know Kamaal as a father. I know him in the community. And for over a decade, I taught at the University of San Diego. And, you know, we built and evolved together. And I'm just proud of you, loved one, for the leadership that you're displaying. And any time that I can be of service for you, your community, for Lemon Grove, we're here to serve you. So keep up the incredible work, and just, you know, much respect and salute to everybody on the call. Thank you for allowing me to be in your space this evening.
Get out the vote, everybody. We're coming up to it.
May I just add, Brian,
Yes.
your textbook or your book that you just wrote, can you please provide that information since we're in the position of adopting books for our classes? I would love to be able to use that as a resource, and you have an open platform for our students to be able to engage and share that knowledge. So if you can provide that information, I'll be more than happy to take a look to adopt it for one of my classes.
I'll make sure you get that. I really appreciate it. Ended on goosebumps. I got goosebumps on that one. I appreciate it. We'll make sure you get that information.
Let's get Kamaal elected mayor of the city, everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. Have a great, great night. Take care.
Hey, and one more thing before you shut it off. I want to remind folks that I'm not the only person on the ballot, and it's gonna be a team sport to get the things done that we need to do. There are two people that you're gonna get to vote for city council. And one of them is right here on that call in Leanna. And I want everybody who's supporting me to know that, you know, she has my vote for city council. And I'm looking forward to working with her and all of you as we continue to take these next steps together. So appreciate y'all.
And your bio, Kamaal, is posted in our Canvas container so our faculty and colleagues can see. And so you have a large support. They're not here physically, personally, but just letting you know, invisibly, you have your support. Sorry.
Beautiful.
Love it.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Be well, y'all.
Good night. Thanks. Bye.